The rain hammered against the marble floors of the mansion as Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her designer heels clicking with finality, but her husband David knelt on the wet pavement outside, his janitor's uniform soaked through as he shielded his elderly mother from the downpour. She had made her choice, throwing them both out into the storm without a second glance. But what she didn't know was that the exhausted man she'd just discarded had signed a multi-billion-dollar government contract just 3 hours earlier. Her new lover Richard stood behind her in an expensive suit, flashing a Rolex and promising her the world. But the watch was a knockoff, and his millions existed only in carefully crafted lies. David's hands trembled as he helped his mother into his decades-old truck, but not from the cold, from the calculations already forming in his mind about exactly how he would dismantle everything Elizabeth had built on his back. She smiled at Richard as they closed the door, already imagining her escape from poverty, but she couldn't see the government officials' business cards falling from David's pocket onto the rain-soaked driveway, each one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. His mother coughed violently in the passenger seat, her frail body shaking, but her eyes held a knowing glint that Elizabeth had always mistaken for weakness rather than the wisdom of a woman who'd once run her own empire. Richard wrapped his arm around Elizabeth's waist, whispering promises of penthouses and luxury, but his phone buzzed incessantly with calls from debt collectors he'd been dodging for months. David started the truck's engine, but before pulling away, he made one phone call that would set everything in motion, a call to his attorney, to his new board of directors, to the machinery of power he'd just inherited. Elizabeth watched the taillights disappear into the rain, feeling victorious, but she had no idea that by morning, her reputation would be the first casualty of a war she didn't know she'd started. What catastrophic revelation would surface about the janitor she'd thrown away like trash? How would the fake millionaire's house of cards collapse and bury Elizabeth beneath the rubble? And what did David's elderly mother know that would make Elizabeth's betrayal not just cruel, but the biggest mistake of her entire life? The fluorescent lights of the Bradshaw Industries building flickered at 11:47 p.m., but David Martinez didn't notice anymore. After 5 years of night shifts, mopping these same floors, the buzz had become white noise in his exhausted mind. His hands, calloused and raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, pushed the mop in methodical strokes across the executive floor, but his thoughts drifted to the mortgage payment due in 3 days and his mother's medication that cost more than he made in a week. The building was silent except for his movements, but somewhere on the 14th floor in a conference room he'd never been allowed to enter during business hours. His entire life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Elizabeth Martinez, she'd insisted on keeping his last name for professional reasons, stood in their bedroom at that exact moment, but her attention was fixed on her phone screen, scrolling through Richard's Instagram feed, showing private jets and vacation homes. She'd met Richard Castellano 3 months ago at a charity gala she'd only attended because David's employer had donated tickets to low-income families, but Richard had swept her off her feet with stories of tech investments and real estate empires. Her reflection in the mirror showed a beautiful woman at 34, but the lines around her eyes betrayed 7 years of marriage to a man who came home smelling like bleach and floor wax, a man whose biggest dream was saving enough for a used car that didn't break down every other month. David's mother, Margaret, sat in the small guest bedroom of their rented house, but her gnarled fingers worked through old photographs from a life Elizabeth had never bothered to ask about. Margaret had been a corporate attorney once, but a stroke 5 years ago had left her partially paralyzed and fully dependent on David's care. Elizabeth saw her as a burden, but Margaret saw through Elizabeth with the clarity of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people in boardrooms and courtrooms. The old woman's hands trembled as she held a photograph from 1987, but her eyes were sharp as she studied her son through the crack in the door as he prepared for another night shift. The call had come to David at 6:43 p.m., but he'd been changing his mother's bedsheets and let it go to voicemail. The voice on the recording belonged to Harrison Webb, Deputy Director of Defense Contracting, but David had assumed it was a scam. They'd been getting a lot of those lately, ever since Elizabeth had given their number to every credit card company and loan shark in the tri-state area. Harrison's message was brief but earth-shattering. Mr. Martinez, regarding the advanced filtration system patent you inherited from your late father, we need to discuss implementation immediately. The contract is worth $4.2 billion over 6 years. Call me back. But David's father had been a janitor too, or so he'd always believed. But what he didn't know was that Miguel Martinez had been an industrial chemist who'd developed a revolutionary water purification system while working night shifts, a system he'd patented under David's name before dying in a factory accident when David was 19. Margaret knew, but Miguel had made her promise not to tell their son until he turned 35. Something about wanting David to build character through hardship, a decision Margaret had disagreed with but honored out of love for her late husband. The patent had sat dormant for 15 years, but recent contamination crises had made Miguel's invention suddenly invaluable to military operations worldwide. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Tomorrow night, leave him. I'll send a car." But Richard's car would be an Uber he'd expensed to a stolen credit card, and his promises of a penthouse were actually a studio apartment he was being evicted from in 2 weeks. Richard had perfected the art of the con, but his targets were usually lonely women with money. Elizabeth was different, a challenge, someone who thought she was trading up when she was actually diving off a cliff. The next morning, David dragged himself home at 6:15 a.m., but Elizabeth was already dressed in designer clothes she'd bought on credit cards he didn't know existed. "We need to talk," she said, but her tone made it clear this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. David's mother sat at the kitchen table, but her hands gripped her coffee cup like she was bracing for impact. "I'm leaving you," Elizabeth continued, but David's exhaustion-fogged brain struggled to process the words. "You're a janitor, David. You'll always be a janitor. I deserve more than this life." But David's phone had been buzzing all morning with calls from the same number, and when he finally answered during Elizabeth's speech, Harrison Webb's urgent voice cut through. "Mr. Martinez, I've been trying to reach you. We have a signing scheduled for 2 p.m. today. The Secretary of Defense himself will be there. This is not optional. National security is involved." David's world tilted, but Elizabeth interpreted his shocked expression as heartbreak over her departure and felt a cruel satisfaction. "I'm taking everything," she said, but legally their prenuptial agreement she'd insisted on actually gave her almost nothing. She'd been so confident in her own career trajectory that she'd signed away rights to his future earnings, which she'd assumed would always be minimal. The rain started at noon, but by 1 p.m. it was a deluge that matched the chaos of David's emotional state. He'd called his mother into the living room, but Elizabeth interrupted, dragging in Richard, who'd arrived in a taxi he'd promised the driver he'd pay later. "This is Richard," Elizabeth announced, but her voice carried a triumph that made David's stomach turn. "He's a millionaire. He's everything you're not." Richard extended his hand, but David noticed the Rolex was loose. Too loose, the way fake watches always sat on wrists they weren't properly sized for. But Margaret spoke then, her stroke-affected voice clearer than it had been in years. "Elizabeth, you're making a terrible mistake." Elizabeth whirled on the old woman, but years of resentment poured out. "You're just like him, useless, taking up space, draining us dry. I'm done with both of you." David started to protest, But Elizabeth was already grabbing his arm, pushing him toward the door. "Get out, both of you. This is my house now." "But it's rented in my name," David said weakly, but Elizabeth laughed. "Richard's lawyers will handle it. Get out." The rain soaked through David's shirt immediately, but he was more focused on helping his mother down the steps, her frail body shaking with each movement. Margaret's fingers dug into his arm, but she whispered, "Let her. Trust me, son. Let her have this moment." Inside, Richard was already calculating how to access the house's equity he assumed existed, but his phone lit up with another debt collector. Elizabeth pressed against him, but she was really pressing against the fantasy of wealth he represented, the escape from a life of struggling to afford groceries and avoiding landlord calls. "We should celebrate," Richard said, but his wallet contained $17 and a Starbucks gift card with 83 cents left. David's truck struggled to start in the rain, but eventually the engine turned over. His signing appointment was in 45 minutes, but he looked like a drowned rat in a janitor's uniform that reeked of floor cleaner. Margaret coughed violently, but when she caught her breath, she pulled out her phone, an old model David had bought her 3 years ago, and made a call. "Catherine," she said to whoever answered, "I need you to bring the box. Yes, all of it. Meet us at the Pentagon contractor entrance at 1:50 p.m. But David was too stunned to ask questions, too overwhelmed to do anything except drive on autopilot toward the address Harrison Webb had texted him 17 times. The Department of Defense facility loomed ahead, but security waved them through after checking David's ID against a list. Someone had cleared them in advance, someone who knew exactly who David Martinez was supposed to be. Catherine turned out to be Margaret's former legal partner, but she was now a senior attorney at one of DC's most prestigious firms. She met them in the parking garage with a garment bag and a briefcase, but more importantly, with knowledge. "Your mother filled me in," Catherine said, but David just stared. "Your father was brilliant, David. He left you something incredible, but he wanted you to earn your own way first. Today you claim your inheritance." The signing ceremony was surreal, but David moved through it in a daze, changing into a suit Catherine had brought, sitting across from military officials and corporate representatives, signing page after page that would make him wealthier than he'd ever imagined. But his mind kept drifting to Elizabeth's face as she'd pushed him into the rain, to the satisfaction in her eyes as she'd chosen Richard's lies over David's truth. Harrison Webb shook his hand at 3:47 p.m., but the gesture felt like it was happening to someone else. "Congratulations, Mr. Martinez. The first payment of $700 million will be wired within 72 hours. But David's first call wasn't to a bank or a financial advisor. It was to Catherine. "I need you to do something for me," he said, but his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I need you to investigate Richard Castellano, everything, and I need you to file eviction proceedings against Elizabeth for the house. It's in my name, my credit, my lease. I want her out in 30 days. Margaret smiled from her wheelchair, but it wasn't cruel. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting years for her son to finally stand up for himself. The investigation into Richard took Catherine's team less than 18 hours, but what they found was spectacular in its depravity. Richard Castellano wasn't his real name. He was actually Richard Castle, a con artist with warrants in 3 states for fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. His tech investments were screenshots he'd photoshopped, but his debts were devastatingly real. $847,000 to various creditors, loan sharks, and at least one very angry bookie in Atlantic City. The Rolex was fake, but so were the Gucci shoes, the Armani suits, and the business cards claiming he was CEO of Castle Enterprises, a company that had never legally existed. But Elizabeth was already in deep, having quit her job as a medical receptionist to focus on charity work with Richard, charity work that consisted of attending free events and posting photos that suggested wealth. She'd also, in a moment of spectacular stupidity, co-signed on a business loan Richard had convinced her would return 300% in 6 months, but the loan was actually from a predatory lender who charged 45% interest and had mob connections. The amount, $125,000, now with Elizabeth's name and social security number attached as the primary guarantor. David's second call was to a public relations firm, but not for himself. He wanted his story told, wanted the world to know what Elizabeth had done. But more than that, he wanted her to see it coming, to know exactly who was dismantling her life and why. The PR team worked fast, but their strategy was surgical. Leak the story to business journals first, then local news, then let it cascade to social media naturally. The first article dropped on a Tuesday morning. Janitor turned billionaire, the Miguel Martinez legacy. But it wasn't just a puff piece. It detailed David's years of hardship, his dedication to caring for his mother, and in carefully worded paragraphs that didn't mention Elizabeth by name but were clearly about her, it described a spouse who'd abandoned him hours before his fortune was revealed, choosing instead a con artist already under federal investigation. Elizabeth saw the article on her phone at 10:23 a.m., but she read it 3 times before the reality penetrated. Richard was beside her in bed, in what had been David's bed, in what was still technically David's house, but he was scrolling through his own phone in panic. His face had been included in the article, not by name, but his photo had been tagged on Elizabeth's social media enough times that facial recognition algorithms had done the rest. The comments section was brutal. Imagine being so stupid you throw away a billionaire for a fake millionaire. But worse were the ones that had found her social media accounts and were currently destroying her reputation in real time. But the eviction notice arrived at 2 p.m., delivered by a process server who looked apologetic but determined. "You have 30 days to vacate," he said. But Elizabeth's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the papers. Richard was already packing, but not to stay with her. He was running, trying to get ahead of the creditors who'd seen the article and realized their target had been exposed. "Where are you going?" Elizabeth screamed, but Richard didn't even look back. "This is your fault," he spat. "You said your husband was nobody. You said there was no money. Do you know what you've done to me?" But what he meant was, "Do you know how many dangerous people now know exactly where to find me?" The call from the predatory lender came at 4:37 p.m., but the voice on the other end was polite in a way that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "Ms. Martinez, regarding your loan payment, the full amount plus interest is due immediately. That's $178,000. We'll expect payment by Friday, or we'll be forced to pursue alternative collection methods." But alternative collection methods from this particular company meant men who didn't bother with legal proceedings. Elizabeth tried calling David, but his number went straight to voicemail. He'd blocked her within hours of being thrown out. She tried his mother, but Margaret's new number was unlisted. She even tried showing up at Bradshaw Industries, but security informed her that Mr. Martinez no longer worked there, and no, they couldn't provide forwarding information. But the media storm was just beginning because someone, David never confirmed it was him, but the timing was perfect, had leaked the full story to a viral content creator who specialized in justice-served narratives. The video dropped on Thursday. Woman throws billionaire husband into rain, immediately regrets it. But it wasn't just the facts. It included interviews with neighbors who'd seen Elizabeth and Richard together for months, with the process server who delivered the eviction notice, even with Catherine, who, in her professional capacity, confirmed the contract value and David's transformation. The video hit 1 million views in 6 hours, but by the end of the day, it had crossed 15 million. Elizabeth's name, her full name, because she'd foolishly made her social media public in her attempts to flaunt Richard's fake wealth, was everywhere. Her phone melted down with notifications, but they were all hate messages, all variations on the same theme. How could you be so stupid, so greedy, so cruel? But the worst came Friday morning, when Richard was arrested at a bus station trying to flee to Mexico, and the news specifically mentioned Elizabeth as his accomplice and co-signer on fraudulent loans. She wasn't arrested, not yet, but the investigation was ongoing, and her association with Richard had thoroughly contaminated her own credibility. David watched it all from his new penthouse, a real penthouse, in a building where monthly HOA fees exceeded what he used to make in a year, but he felt no joy. His mother sat beside him, but her expression was complicated. "Do you feel better?" Margaret asked, but David shook his head. "I feel nothing," he admitted, but that wasn't quite true. He felt betrayed, angry, vindicated, and somehow still heartbroken over the woman Elizabeth had pretended to be 7 years ago. But Margaret patted his hand with her trembling fingers. "Your father wanted you to know hardship before wealth," she said, but her voice carried a weight of experience. "He believed it would make you appreciate what you had, make you wise about who to trust." Elizabeth failed that test. She revealed who she truly was when she thought you had nothing. The company David now essentially owned, Titan Corp., created to manage the government contracts and his father's patents, required his attention, but he found himself surprisingly adept at business decisions. His years of night shifts had taught him efficiency, but his years of poverty had taught him the value of every dollar. His first major decision was to implement a company-wide policy. Janitors, maintenance workers, and service staff would receive the same benefits as executives: full health care, retirement matching, and a living wage that didn't require second jobs. But his second decision was personal. He established a foundation in his father's name for children of single parents and caregivers, offering scholarships and support systems. Margaret would run it, but only in an advisory capacity. Her health couldn't handle full-time work, but her mind was still sharp enough to guide others. Elizabeth's 30 days expired on a Wednesday, but she'd already been gone for 2 weeks, forced to move in with a friend who was increasingly uncomfortable with the media attention. The house stood empty when David drove by, just once, just to see, but he felt no triumph at the sight of the "for rent" sign in the window. He'd instructed his property manager to rent it to a family in need at below-market rates, but only after Elizabeth's belongings had been properly stored and made available to her. He wasn't cruel, but he was done being her safety net. Richard's trial was set for 6 months out, but the charges were extensive enough that his public defender had already started talking. Plea deals. Elizabeth had been interviewed by investigators but not charged. Her primary crime had been stupidity and greed, but those weren't technically illegal, just devastatingly expensive. The loan she'd co-signed on had been sold to a debt collection agency who was slightly more legitimate but no less determined to collect. But the twist that nobody saw coming happened 3 months after David's signing ceremony, when Catherine called with news that made even his new reality seem surreal. "Elizabeth is pregnant," Catherine said, but before David could respond, she continued, "and she's claiming it's yours, filing for support based on the marriage's legal standing." David's blood ran cold, but Catherine's voice carried a hint of satisfaction. "She's lying, obviously. The timeline doesn't work. You'd been on different shifts for 4 months, barely seeing each other. I'm guessing it's Richard's, but she knows he has nothing. She's desperate." The paternity test David demanded came back exactly as expected. Not his child, but Richard's, conceived during one of Elizabeth's late-night charity events that had actually been hotel room trysts. The test results were filed in court, but more importantly, they obliterated Elizabeth's last remaining credibility. The blog posts and social media discussions that had already been brutal turned thermonuclear. She wasn't just greedy and stupid, but also an attempted fraud who'd tried to trap a billionaire with another man's baby. But David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He established a trust fund for the child, not for Elizabeth's access, but held until the baby turned 18, worth exactly $1 million. No child should suffer for their parents' mistakes, he told Catherine, but his voice was firm. But Elizabeth gets nothing, not 1 cent from me, not now, not ever. The media loved it, but for once they loved David for the right reasons. Here was a man who'd been betrayed in the most fundamental ways, but still chose compassion over revenge when it came to an innocent child. The story went viral again, but this time with David positioned as the hero, the man who'd risen above bitterness to do the right thing. Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter 7 months later, but David only knew because Catherine informed him the trust had been established and secured. He never met the child, but he sometimes wondered if she'd grow up knowing her mother had thrown away a fortune for a con artist's lies. Margaret said not to think about it, but even she admitted curiosity about whether Elizabeth would ever tell her daughter the truth. But Richard, sentenced to 12 years for his various frauds, had no such luxury of distance. Prison gave him plenty of time to reflect on how a simple con had spiraled into federal charges because he'd targeted the wrong woman at exactly the wrong time. If he'd known David was signing a $1 billion contract that day, but that knowledge wouldn't have helped him, because Richard's entire life had been built on lies that were always destined to collapse eventually. Elizabeth worked 3 jobs now, waitressing, retail, night cleaning at an office building that wasn't Bradshaw Industries but was depressingly similar. But she could barely cover rent and daycare and the payment plan she'd negotiated with the debt collectors who'd bought her loan. Her daughter would have everything she needed, thanks to David's trust. But Elizabeth would spend the next decade paying for 30 seconds of cruelty on a rainy afternoon when she'd thrown away the one person who'd truly loved her. But David, standing on his penthouse balcony 2 years after that rainy night, watching the city lights spread out like fallen stars, felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. His mother sat inside, healthier now with access to the best medical care money could buy, but more importantly surrounded by purpose as she built the foundation into something that would outlive them both. "Do you ever think about her?" Margaret asked one evening, but David shook his head. "I think about who I thought she was," he admitted, but his voice was steady. "But that person never existed. I was in love with a fantasy, with potential I imagined she had. The real Elizabeth showed herself when she thought I was worth nothing." But the story wasn't quite over, because on the 3-year anniversary of his contract signing, David received a letter forwarded through Catherine's office. Elizabeth's handwriting was immediately recognizable, but the words were unexpected. "David, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that every day I live with what I did, what I threw away, what I destroyed. Not the money, though God knows the poverty is its own hell, but you. You were good and kind and decent, and I treated you like garbage. Richard is in prison. My daughter asks about her father, and I have to lie. I work the same kind of jobs you used to work, and every night I understand a little more what you sacrificed for us. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that I know. I see it now, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But David never responded to the letter because some apologies come too late and some betrayals cut too deep for words to heal. He kept it though, but not out of bitterness, out of remembrance, a reminder of who he'd been, what he'd survived, and how far he'd come. Margaret found it months later while cleaning his desk. But she didn't ask about it. She simply placed it back where she'd found it. But her expression was thoughtful. Her son had become the man his father had hoped he'd be, not through wealth, but through hardship. The money just made it easier to do good in the world. The viral video about David's story eventually faded from social media's hyperactive attention span, but not before racking up over 60 million views across various platforms and spawning countless reaction videos, analysis pieces, and even a podcast series. David had declined all interview requests, but his silence only made the story more compelling, more mythical. But on a Tuesday morning 4 years after being thrown into the rain, David stood in front of his father's grave, a modest marker in a working-class cemetery that David could now afford to replace with marble and gold, but chose to leave exactly as it was. "I understand now," he said to the stone, but his words were carried away by the same kind of rain that had soaked him that transformative night. "You wanted me to know what it meant to have nothing, so I'd appreciate everything. You wanted me to be tested, to see who'd stand by me when I had nothing to offer. Mission accomplished, Dad." Margaret stood beside him under an umbrella, but her free hand gripped his arm with strength that belied her frail appearance. "He'd be proud," she said, but David wasn't sure. Proud of his success, maybe, but his father had also been deeply in love with David's mother. Their marriage had been a partnership built on genuine affection. Would Miguel be proud that his son's marriage had failed so spectacularly? But perhaps that was the final lesson, David thought. Not everyone passes the tests life sets before them, and you can't control other people's choices, only your own responses to them. Elizabeth had failed, but David had risen. Richard had lied, but David had built something real. The rain had seemed like the worst moment of his life, but it had actually been the beginning of his liberation. The company continued to grow, but David remained surprisingly grounded. He drove a nice car, but not an absurdly expensive one. He lived well, but not lavishly. He dressed in quality clothes, but he still knew exactly how much a gallon of milk cost, because he still bought his own groceries. His employees loved him, but not because he was generous with money, because he was generous with respect, with dignity, with the acknowledgement that every person's work had value regardless of their position. But Elizabeth's life continued its downward trajectory, each year bringing new struggles as compound interest on her debts, and the cost of raising a child alone in an expensive city ground her down further. She'd aged a decade in 5 years, but more than that, she'd lost something fundamental, the ability to look at herself in the mirror without flinching. Her daughter was beautiful and healthy thanks to David's trust, ensuring proper nutrition and health care. But Elizabeth knew with crushing certainty that she'd have nothing if not for the mercy of the man she'd betrayed. Richard, eligible for parole in 7 years if he behaved, spent his time in prison, writing letters to Elizabeth that she never answered. His letters weren't apologetic but accusatory. If she hadn't been so obvious about the affair, if she'd been smarter about the timing, if she'd just waited a few more months to leave David, they could have been rich together. But the delusion was almost impressive. Richard still didn't grasp that David would never have shared his fortune with the wife who'd betrayed him, that no amount of legal maneuvering would have given Elizabeth access to money earned after she'd chosen to end their marriage. But the question that haunted Elizabeth's 3 a.m. insomnia wasn't about the money. It was simpler and more devastating. If she'd just been patient, if she'd just been kind, if she'd just waited one more day, would David have forgiven her? Would he have shared his fortune with the wife who'd stood by him through poverty? The answer, she knew with soul-crushing certainty, was yes. David had loved her. He'd have given her everything, and she'd thrown it away for Instagram photos with a fake Rolex. The viral nature of her story meant Elizabeth could never escape it. Every new job required explanations when coworkers inevitably Googled her name. Every new relationship ended when dates discovered who she was. Every parent at her daughter's daycare knew her as that woman from the video. She'd become a cautionary tale, a meme, a punchline. But worse than the public humiliation was the private knowledge that she deserved every bit of it. David, meanwhile, had found something unexpected in the ruins of his marriage. Himself. Not the man he'd been with Elizabeth, always trying to prove his worth, always apologizing for not earning enough, always feeling like he was failing, but the man he actually was, capable, intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to build an empire while maintaining his humanity. But he didn't date much despite countless opportunities. Beautiful women who appeared at charity galas he now attended, professional women who saw him as an eligible bachelor, even a few genuine souls who seemed interested in the man rather than the money. Trust was difficult now, but more than that, David had learned to enjoy his own company, to find fulfillment in his work and his mother's recovery, and the foundation's impact rather than in external validation. Margaret told him not to let Elizabeth's betrayal close his heart, but David assured her it hadn't. It had simply taught him to be more careful about who he let in. Besides, he'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I'm only 38. I have time." But time was something Elizabeth no longer felt she had. Her daughter was growing, the debts seemed endless, and every year added new lines to her face and new regrets to her collection. She'd started writing letters to David that she never sent, confessions and apologies that filled notebooks she kept, hidden from her daughter. The unsent letters were therapy she couldn't afford, but they didn't ease the weight of what she'd done. The final twist came 6 years after that rainy night, when David received word that Richard had died in prison. Not dramatically, but pathetically, a heart attack at 43 brought on by untreated hypertension and the stress of incarceration. David felt nothing about Richard's death, but he wondered briefly if Elizabeth knew, if she grieved for the man who'd destroyed her life, with promises he could never keep. But Elizabeth did know because Richard's mother had tracked her down to bitterly inform her that her son had died, still claiming he'd loved Elizabeth, still insisting their plans would have worked if David hadn't gotten lucky. The conversation had been surreal. Two women whose lives had been demolished by the same con artist's lies, but neither able to comfort the other because Elizabeth had been a willing participant in her own destruction. David learned about Elizabeth's reaction months later through a private investigator he'd finally stopped paying, not because he cared, but because Margaret had gently suggested that perhaps it was time to fully let go, to stop monitoring someone who no longer had any relevance to his life. The investigator's final report noted that Elizabeth had taken her daughter to Richard's grave once, but she'd told the child only that this was someone Mommy knew who made very bad choices. But the story that had gone viral 6 years ago continued to live online, periodically resurfacing whenever someone rediscovered it and shared it again. Each resurrection brought new comments, new reactions, new people discovering Elizabeth's face and name and judging her across the permanent record of the internet. David's name remained protected. The PR firm had ensured his privacy was maintained, but Elizabeth had no such shield. The foundation David had built in his father's name had helped over 10,000 families by year 7, but more importantly, it had fundamentally changed how government contractors thought about service workers' compensation. David's policies had been adopted by 3 other major defense contractors, but the ripple effects reached far beyond. Janitors, maintenance workers, service staff across multiple industries now had advocates and support systems that hadn't existed before. Margaret passed away peacefully in year 8, but not before telling David one final time how proud she was, not of his wealth, but of his character. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through the foundation, but also by David's former co-workers from Bradshaw Industries, janitors and night shift workers, who remembered him as one of their own, who'd celebrated his success as a victory for everyone who'd ever been overlooked or underestimated. But at the funeral, David broke down. Not from grief, though that was certainly present, but from the realization of how close he'd come to never knowing any of this. If Elizabeth had waited one more day, if she'd never met Richard, if she'd just been a slightly better person, he'd still be mopping floors and struggling to afford his mother's medication. Margaret's death would have come years earlier from lack of proper medical care, but the foundation would never have existed. Those 10,000 families would still be struggling, and David would never have known he was capable of all he'd achieved. "She saved you," Catherine said at the wake, but David looked puzzled. "Elizabeth," Catherine clarified, but her voice was thoughtful. "By showing you who she really was, by forcing you out of that life, she accidentally gave you the push you needed to claim your inheritance. If she'd been better, you'd have stayed stuck." But David shook his head, because that logic felt too neat, too much like justifying cruelty with outcomes. "She didn't save me," he said quietly, but his voice was firm. "She revealed herself. I saved myself. The circumstances were just circumstances. I could have chosen bitterness, revenge, could have become as cruel as she was. I chose differently. And that, perhaps, was the real lesson of the viral story that millions had watched and judged. Not that bad people get punished, or that good things come to those who wait, but that character is revealed in crisis, and who we choose to become in our worst moments matters more than what happens to us." Elizabeth, watching her daughter blow out candles on her 6th birthday in their cramped apartment, thought about David for the 1,000th time but didn't dare reach out. She'd heard about Margaret's death through the same internet grapevine that had destroyed her reputation, but she'd sent no condolences, made no contact. What could she possibly say that would matter? But her daughter, beautiful and bright with Richard's eyes and Elizabeth's determination, asked questions Elizabeth couldn't answer. "Why don't I have a daddy who visits?" And "Why did that man set up money for me?" And someday, inevitably, "What did you do to him, Mom?" David stood on his penthouse balcony 10 years after that rainy night. But now he wasn't alone. A woman named Jennifer, an architect he'd met through normal circumstances without any knowledge of his wealth, stood beside him. They'd been dating for 8 months, but David had told her everything on their 3rd date, wanting no secrets, no surprises. Jennifer had Googled the story, watched the video, and then said simply, "She was an idiot. Her loss, my gain." The viral video had been viewed over 200 million times across platforms by year 10, but David barely thought about it anymore. New viral stories emerged daily, but his had staying power because it touched something universal, the fantasy that people who wrong us will face consequences, that justice exists, that good character eventually prevails over selfishness. But the truth was more complicated than the viral narrative suggested, because David hadn't prevailed. He'd survived. He'd made choices in the aftermath of trauma that happened to work out well, but they could have easily gone differently. If the government contract had fallen through, if his mother had died before he could claim it, if any number of small variables had shifted, he'd be just another abandoned husband working night shifts and struggling to survive. Elizabeth understood this in her bones now, but understanding came too late to change anything. She'd made her choices based on who she thought she was, someone destined for better things, too good for a janitor husband, but life had revealed who she actually was, someone unable to see value in goodness, blinded by surface flash and empty promises. Her daughter would grow up with opportunities Elizabeth had thrown away, but every college application funded by David's trust, every summer program and music lesson and medical appointment paid for by his mercy, would be a reminder of her mother's catastrophic failure. Elizabeth had ensured her daughter would have chances she'd never had, but only by destroying her own life so completely that David's compassion had extended to an innocent child despite the mother's betrayal. But the question the internet never asked, the one that didn't fit the viral narrative, was whether Elizabeth was capable of change. 10 years of poverty and consequences had taught her lessons she'd refused to learn in 7 years of marriage. But was redemption possible for someone who'd thrown a man and his elderly mother into the rain? David didn't think about that question, because Elizabeth's redemption, or lack thereof, wasn't his responsibility. He'd done the right thing for her daughter, but Elizabeth herself was beyond his concern, neither forgiven nor actively hated, just past, a chapter that had closed violently, but completely. The story that had made David viral, that had destroyed Elizabeth's reputation, that had contributed to Richard's death in prison, lived on in the internet's eternal memory. But for the people who'd actually lived it, life had moved forward in ways both predictable and surprising. David had found success and peace, but not perfect happiness. Trauma leaves scars even when everything works out. Elizabeth had found consequences and regret, but also hard-won wisdom that came too late to save her from her own choices. And a little girl who bore Richard's genetics and Elizabeth's mistakes would grow up with resources neither parent had provided, a final mercy from a man who'd been shown none. The rain still fell on the city where it had all happened, but David no longer flinched at the sound of drops on windows, no longer felt that visceral memory of kneeling on wet pavement while his world collapsed. Time had healed what could be healed, but more importantly, success and purpose had rebuilt what betrayal had destroyed. But sometimes late at night, when Jennifer was asleep beside him and the city lights seemed to blur together into constellation, David allowed himself to wonder, what if Elizabeth had been different? What if she'd seen his worth when he had nothing? What if she'd waited just one more day? The answers didn't matter, but the questions remained, because that's what betrayal does. It doesn't just change what happened, but haunts what might have been. Elizabeth had made her choice in a moment of cruelty and greed, but that choice had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined, destroying her life while inadvertently liberating his. And perhaps that was the real story behind the viral video, behind the millions of views and endless comments. Not justice or karma or even redemption, but simply the profound truth that we rarely understand the full consequences of our cruelty until it's far too late to take it back. Elizabeth understood that now, working her third shift of the day, her feet aching in shoes that needed replacing, her daughter asleep at a neighbor's because childcare during night shifts cost more than she could afford despite David's trust covering everything else. She understood, but understanding changed nothing, fixed nothing, redeemed nothing. The janitor's mop moved across floors she now cleaned. Different building, same exhaustion, but she thought about David every time she pushed it forward, wondered if he remembered these movements, this tiredness, this particular kind of poverty that wasn't just financial but spiritual. She'd thrown him away like garbage, but garbage could be valuable if you knew what you had. She hadn't known. She knew now. But now was too late, and too late was forever, and forever was exactly how long her choice would follow her. Through every viral resurrection of the video, every pitying look from co-workers who'd Googled her name, every moment her daughter asked questions Elizabeth couldn't answer without admitting she'd destroyed their lives for a fake Rolex and empty promises. The story ended not with reconciliation or revenge, but with the quiet reality of consequences. David built his empire, Elizabeth survived her poverty, and between them stretched 10 years and a rainy night, when cruelty had revealed character and changed everything forever. But the video still played somewhere, still racked up views, still prompted comments about karma and justice and lessons learned. And 200 million people who'd never lived it, nodded along, certain they'd never make Elizabeth's mistake, confident they'd recognize value when they saw it, sure they'd be different. But would they? That was the question the viral video couldn't answer, the lesson that couldn't be taught through someone else's pain. You never really know who you are until you're tested, until circumstances strip away pretense and force you to choose between comfort and character, between easy lies and hard truths, between the person you think you are and who you actually prove to be when everything's on the line. David had been tested and had chosen himself, his integrity, his future. Elizabeth had been tested and had chosen a fantasy, a con artist, and her own destruction. And somewhere between those choices lay the entire story, viral, tragic, and as permanent as the rain that had fallen that night and would fall again, washing nothing away, changing everything, and leaving scars that time could fade, but never fully heal. 15 years after the rain, David stood in a conference room that overlooked the city, but his attention wasn't on the skyline he'd helped reshape with his philanthropic projects. It was on the young woman sitting across from him, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Sophia Castle, but she'd introduced herself as Sophie Martin, using her maternal grandmother's maiden name in what David recognized as a futile attempt at anonymity. She was 16 now, but her eyes held the kind of premature wisdom that came from growing up as a viral cautionary tale's collateral damage. "You didn't have to see me," Sophie said, but her voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear beneath her practiced composure. David had agreed to this meeting despite Catherine's strong objections, but something in the girl's carefully worded email had struck him. Not manipulation, but genuine curiosity about the man who'd shaped her life from a distance. "Your mother doesn't know you're here," David observed, but it wasn't a question. Sophie shook her head, but her resemblance to Richard was startling now that she'd grown into her features, the same sharp cheekbones, the same intense gaze, but without the predatory calculation that had defined her father. "She'd lose her mind if she knew," Sophie admitted, but then added quietly, "She still can't say your name without crying." But David felt nothing at that revelation, no satisfaction or sympathy, just the mild interest of someone hearing about a stranger's emotional state. Jennifer, now his wife of 7 years, had asked him not to meet with Sophie, but she'd also said she'd support whatever he decided. "Some ghosts need facing," Jennifer had said, but David wasn't sure if Sophie was a ghost or just a consequence that had finally learned to speak. "Why did you want to see me?" David asked, but he kept his tone neutral, neither warm nor cold. Sophie's fingers twisted together, but she met his eyes with unexpected directness. "Because you're the most important person in my life who I've never met," she said, but then corrected herself. "No, that's not quite right. You're the reason. I have a life at all. The trust, the medical care, the school. Mom works 3 jobs and we'd still be homeless without you. But more than that, I needed to understand." Understand what? But David suspected he already knew, had known since reading her email 3 weeks ago requesting this meeting. Sophie took a breath, but her composure was fracturing. "How you could be so kind to me when my existence must remind you of the worst thing that ever happened to you. When my father helped destroy your marriage and my mother threw you away like—" Her voice broke completely, but tears didn't fall. She'd learned to cry silently, David realized, probably from years of not wanting to burden her struggling mother. But David leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "You aren't your parents," he said finally, but his voice was gentle in a way it hadn't been in the first part of this conversation. "You didn't choose to be born into their mess. The trust isn't charity and it's not kindness. It's basic human decency. No child should suffer for their parents' mistakes." "But I've read everything," Sophie said, but now the words came faster, pressured by years of holding them in. Every article, every comment, every think piece about what my mother did. I've seen the video. It has 400 million views now. Did you know that? Someone posts it every few months and it goes viral all over again. I've watched my mother get destroyed online over and over, and the worst part is that she deserves it. She was cruel and selfish and stupid, and I'm the daughter of that cruelty. But David held up his hand, stopping her spiral. "You're also 16, he said, but his tone was firmer now. "And you're carrying weight that isn't yours to carry. Yes, your mother made catastrophic choices. Yes, your father was a con artist and a criminal, but you're a straight-A student who volunteers at the literacy center your grandmother works at, who takes care of her mother when she's exhausted from those 3 jobs, who applied to this meeting through my foundation's official channels rather than trying to manipulate personal contact. I know because I have your file." Sophie's eyes widened, but David continued. "I've watched your life from a distance, not obsessively, but enough to know that the trust was being used properly, that you were thriving despite everything. You're not your parents, Sophie. You're yourself. And from what I can see, you're a good person in spite of them, not because of them." But the tears came now, silent and steady, and David felt something crack in the carefully maintained walls he'd built around this entire situation. He'd told himself for 15 years that Sophie was just a line item in his charitable giving, but sitting across from her now, seeing her struggle with guilt she didn't earn and shame she didn't deserve, he recognized something he hadn't expected. She was just a kid trying to make sense of being born into a viral disaster. "Does it ever stop?" Sophie asked, but she was wiping her eyes furiously, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "The story, I mean, does it ever just go away?" David shook his head slowly, but his expression was sympathetic. "It's been 15 years and it still resurfaces regularly. The internet doesn't forget, Sophie. That's a truth you need to accept, not because it's fair, but because fighting it will destroy you." "It's already destroying Mom," Sophie said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "She's 49 but looks 65. She works herself to exhaustion and still can't afford basic things without the trust. She never dates, never goes out, barely has friends. And every time someone recognizes her, every time the video goes viral again, she shuts down for days. I'm scared she's going to—" But Sophie couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that her mother's guilt and shame would eventually become unbearable. But David's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been concern crossing his face. "Is she in danger?" he asked. But Sophie shook her head quickly. "Not like that. She'd never. I'm her reason for living. She tells me that constantly. But she's dying slowly anyway from regret and shame and working herself to death trying to prove she's not the monster everyone thinks she is." David stood and walked to the window, but his reflection in the glass showed a man wrestling with complications he'd long since tried to bury. "I can't fix your mother, Sophie," he said, but his voice was quiet. "Even if I wanted to, and I'm not sure I do, some things are beyond repair. The trust is structured to take care of you until you're 30, with additional funds available for graduate school or starting a business. That's all I can offer." "I'm not asking you to fix her," Sophie said, but she'd stood too, moving to stand a respectful distance from him at the window. I don't even know what I'm asking, maybe just to understand how you survived what she did to you without becoming bitter. Because I'm so angry at her sometimes, and I hate myself for it because she's trying so hard, but I'm also angry that I have to be grateful to a stranger for basic necessities because my mother destroyed our lives before I was even born." But David turned to look at her fully, and in that moment Sophie saw not the billionaire or the viral victim or the distant benefactor, but just a man who'd survived something terrible and built something meaningful from the wreckage. "You survive by choosing who you want to be every single day," he said, but his voice carried the weight of 15 years of making that choice. Your anger at your mother is valid. Your guilt about that anger is unnecessary. Both things can be true. She made terrible choices and she's paying for them, but she's also still your mother and you're allowed to love her while hating what she did. Did you ever forgive her? Sophie asked. But David's silence was answer enough. Finally, he spoke. Forgiveness isn't something you owe anyone, Sophie. It's not a debt your mother can work off or a gift I'm obligated to give. Some betrayals are simply too deep. But I did let go of the active hatred, the desire for revenge. Not for her sake, for mine. Carrying that poison was hurting me more than her. But Sophie nodded slowly, processing this in a way that suggested she'd been carrying her own poison, her own complicated feelings about being the child of a viral villain. When I turn 18, she said carefully, but her voice was stronger now. I'm changing my name legally, not just using Grandma's name informally, but making it official. I'm going to college across the country where nobody knows the story. I'm going to build a life where I'm not that woman's daughter or the trust fund kid from the viral video. Is that running away? No, David said immediately, but his voice was firm. That's called survival. That's called choosing your own narrative. Your mother's choices don't define you, but they will follow you if you let them. Creating distance is smart, not cowardly. But then he paused, considering something he'd never intended to say. The trust has a provision you don't know about yet. When you turn 21, there's an additional sum available specifically for therapy, mental health support, whatever you need to process all of this. I added it 5 years ago when I realized that the financial support wasn't enough. You'd need emotional support too. Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. Why? She asked, but the question contained multitudes. Why did you help me? Why do you care? Why aren't you as cold as you have every right to be? David's answer was simple but devastatingly honest. Because you were innocent. Because I knew what it was like to grow up with limited resources, and I had the power to change that for you. And because... He paused, but then continued. Because my mother believed in breaking cycles of harm. She would have wanted me to help you. But they stood in silence for a moment, two people connected by circumstances neither had chosen, looking out over a city that had witnessed their intertwined tragedies. Can I ask you something else? Sophie said eventually, but David nodded. Do you think my mom is capable of being better? Not forgiven, not redeemed exactly, but just better than she was? David considered this carefully, but his answer was measured. I think people can change, but usually only if they're changing for themselves, not to escape consequences or earn forgiveness. Your mother's motivations, I can't speak to those, but I'll tell you this. She kept you, raised you, worked herself to exhaustion for you, despite having an option for a much easier path. She could have given you up, could have run from the responsibility. She didn't. That's not redemption, but it's not nothing either. But Sophie looked surprised, as if this perspective had never occurred to her. I never thought about it that way, she admitted, but then added, though she tells me constantly that I'm the only good thing she's ever done, which is a lot of pressure for a 16-year-old. That's not fair to you, David agreed, but his voice carried a hint of sympathy, not for Elizabeth, but for the daughter struggling under the weight of being someone's sole source of meaning. You're not responsible for your mother's redemption or happiness. You're only responsible for your own life, your own choices, your own future. But the meeting was winding down. Both of them could feel it, and Sophie seemed to gather her courage for one final question. If things had been different, if my mom had been better, if she'd never met my father, if she'd just loved you the way you deserved, do you think you'd have been happy? David's laugh was unexpected but genuine, though edged with irony. "I'm happy now, Sophie. Happier than I would have been in a marriage to someone who was only staying because I had money. Your mother showed me who she really was, and as brutal as that revelation was, it freed me to find someone who loves me for who I am, not what I have. So no, I don't wonder about what might have been. The reality I have is better than any fantasy I was living back then." Sophie nodded, but something in her expression had shifted. A burden had lightened, even if just slightly. "Thank you," she said, but the words carried more weight than simple politeness. "For the trust, for the meeting, for treating me like a person instead of just a reminder of the worst thing that happened to you. I know you didn't have to do any of this." But David extended his hand, and when Sophie shook it, his grip was firm but kind. "You're going to be fine, Sophie Martin," he said, but he used her chosen name deliberately, acknowledging her right to define herself. "Better than fine. You've survived being born into a viral catastrophe with grace and intelligence. College will be the beginning of your story, not the continuation of your parents' mistakes." Sophie left the conference room with her shoulders straighter than when she'd entered, but David watched her go with complicated feelings he hadn't expected. He'd meant what he said. She wasn't her parents. She deserved her own life. But seeing her had forced him to confront something he'd avoided for 15 years. Elizabeth's choices had consequences that extended far beyond her own ruined reputation. But his phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "How did it go?" David typed back, "Better than expected. She's a good kid. Not her fault she was born into a mess." Jennifer's response came immediately. "You did a good thing setting up that trust. Come home. I made your favorite dinner and I want to hear all about it." David smiled, but as he gathered his things to leave, he allowed himself one moment of reflection on the full scope of what had happened 15 years ago. Elizabeth had thrown him into the rain and lost everything. Richard had died in prison. Sophie had been born into the wreckage. And David had built an empire, married a woman who loved him truly, and somehow managed to help a child who reminded him of his darkest moment without letting bitterness poison the act. But the story that had gone viral all those years ago, that still resurfaced regularly with its 400 million views, told only the simplest version. Cruel wife gets her comeuppance. Discarded husband becomes a billionaire. The reality was infinitely more complex. Sophie's existence, Elizabeth's slow-motion collapse, the ripple effects that touched lives in ways the viral narrative never captured. Meanwhile, across the city in a small apartment, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, but her hands trembled as she held her phone. Sophie had said she was studying at the library, but Elizabeth's mother's intuition, the one thing she'd actually developed over 16 years, told her something else was happening. She'd learned not to track Sophie's movements too closely, learned that trust was something she had to give her daughter, even though trust had been the thing she'd destroyed in her own life. But Elizabeth's shift at the cleaning company started in 2 hours, and she needed to sleep, but sleep had been difficult for 15 years now. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face in the rain, saw his mother's frail body shaking in the cold, saw the moment when her greed and cruelty had destroyed everything. The therapist at the free clinic had called it PTSD, but Elizabeth knew it was simpler than that. Guilt. Pure, unrelenting, deserved guilt. Her phone buzzed with a notification, but it was what she dreaded most. Someone had tagged her in a comment on the video. Again. The cycle was eternal. Every few months, the algorithm would resurface the story, and a new generation would discover what she'd done. Judge her, condemn her, remind her that the internet never forgets and never forgives. She didn't read the comments anymore, but she saw the numbers. 487,632,109 views. Nearly 500 million people had witnessed her worst moment, her greatest failure, her complete destruction. But Sophie came home at 8 p.m., and Elizabeth noticed immediately that something was different about her daughter, a lightness in her step, a peace in her expression that hadn't been there at breakfast. "Good day at the library?" Elizabeth asked, but she was trying to keep her tone casual, not accusatory. Sophie hesitated, but then made a decision that would change their relationship fundamentally. "I met with David Martinez today," she said, but she said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. Elizabeth's face went white, but Sophie continued before her mother could speak. "I reached out through his foundation's official channels. He agreed to meet me. We talked for an hour." Elizabeth sat down heavily, but her hands gripped the edge of the table, like she was trying to keep from falling despite already being seated. "Why?" she managed, but the word was barely a whisper. Sophie sat across from her, but her expression was earnest, not defiant. "Because I needed to understand him. Because he's been part of my life since before I was born, but I'd never actually talked to him. Because I wanted to thank him for the trust, for giving me opportunities you and Dad couldn't." But Elizabeth flinched at the word Dad, because she'd always referred to Richard that way to Sophie, despite his death and his crimes, unable to bring herself to erase him completely from their narrative. "What did he say?" Elizabeth asked, but she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Sophie considered her answer carefully, but ultimately chose honesty. "He said I wasn't responsible for your choices or Dad's. He said the trust was basic human decency, not charity. He said I should change my name and go to college across the country and build my own life away from the story." Elizabeth's tears came then, but they were complicated. Grief and relief and shame all mixed together. "He's right," she said, but her voice broke. "You should run as far from me as possible. You should build a life where nobody knows what I did, where you're not carrying my mistakes." "Stop," Sophie interrupted, but her voice was firm. "That's exactly what he said you'd say, that you'd make my choices about your guilt instead of about my future. I'm changing my name and moving across the country because I want to, not because I'm running from you. You're my mom. You made terrible choices before I was born, but you've also worked yourself to death trying to give me a decent life, despite those choices." But Elizabeth shook her head, unable to accept the partial absolution her daughter was offering. "I destroyed our lives, Sophie. Everything you've had came from David's mercy, not my efforts. I'm the reason you need a new name, the reason you have to move across the country, the reason strangers send you hate messages when they figure out who you are." "Yes," Sophie agreed, but her voice wasn't cruel. "But you're also the reason I exist, and you chose to keep me and raise me when you could have made that easier on yourself. David pointed that out, that you had options for an easier path, and you chose the harder one because of me. That's not redemption, but it's not nothing." But the conversation continued late into the night, mother and daughter finally having the honest discussion they'd avoided for 16 years, and something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Sophie understood her mother's humanity better, the weakness and greed that had led to catastrophic choices, but also the genuine love and effort that had followed. Elizabeth understood her daughter's need for independence, not as rejection, but as survival. David, at home with Jennifer, shared the details of his meeting, but he admitted something he'd never voiced before. "I spent 15 years telling myself I felt nothing about Elizabeth or her daughter, that they were just footnotes in my history. But seeing Sophie today, hearing about Elizabeth's slow-motion collapse, I realized I do feel something. Not forgiveness, not sympathy exactly, but maybe acknowledgement that nobody's story is as simple as a viral video makes it seem." But Jennifer, wise in the way that comes from loving someone with complicated trauma, simply held his hand. "You're allowed to have complicated feelings," she said, but her voice was gentle. You were cruel, betrayed, but you also used that betrayal to build something meaningful. Both things are true, and Sophie is innocent in all of it, but so are you. Sometimes there's no neat resolution, just people doing their best with the wreckage they've been given. The viral video hit 500 million views on its 17th anniversary, but by then, Sophie was in her second year at a university in Oregon under the name Sophie Martin, studying social work and volunteering with organizations that helped children of incarcerated parents. She'd told a few close friends about her history, but most people knew her simply as Sophie. Smart, kind, passionate about helping others, unconnected to the viral catastrophe that had defined her childhood. Elizabeth, 51 but looking older, still worked her 3 jobs, but she'd started attending a support group for people whose mistakes had gone viral. She was the oldest member by far. Most viral infamy was newer, fresher, but she found unexpected comfort in sharing space with others who understood the peculiar hell of having your worst moment preserved eternally in the internet's amber. But David, at 48, had stopped checking for updates on the story years ago. His life had moved so far beyond that rainy night that it felt like something that had happened to a different person. His company had expanded globally. The foundation had helped over 50,000 families, and his marriage to Jennifer had produced 2 children who would grow up never knowing poverty, never understanding the desperation that had once defined their father's existence. The 3 of them, David, Elizabeth, and Sophie, never spoke again after that single meeting between David and Sophie, but their lives remained loosely connected through the trust fund that would continue until Sophie's 30th birthday. David would receive annual reports on the trust's distributions, would see line items for college tuition and textbooks and therapy sessions, and would feel satisfied that his one act of mercy was serving its purpose. Elizabeth would struggle for the rest of her life with the consequences of 30 seconds of cruelty, but she would also find small moments of peace. In Sophie's graduation photos, in the granddaughter she'd meet when Sophie was 29, in the knowledge that despite destroying her own life, she'd raised a daughter who'd broken the cycle of selfishness and cruelty. But Sophie, carrying both David's mercy and her mother's mistakes, would build a career helping children navigate the aftermath of their parents' choices. She'd tell her own story sometimes in professional contexts where it could help others, but she'd learned to separate herself from the viral narrative. She wasn't the baby born from betrayal. She was Sophie Martin, social worker, advocate, survivor of circumstances she didn't create, but refused to let define her. The rain still fell on the city where it all began, but now 3 separate lives unfolded beneath it, lives that had intersected catastrophically once and then diverged into their own trajectories. The viral video still played, still accumulated views, still sparked debates about karma and justice and consequences, but the real people behind it had moved beyond the neat narrative into messy, complicated, fully human existences. And perhaps that was the real epilogue, not redemption or revenge or resolution, but simply life continuing in all its complex, contradictory reality, long after the internet had reduced it to a simple morality tale. David had built his empire and found his peace. Elizabeth had paid for her cruelty and found a measure of purpose in raising Sophie. And Sophie had transcended them both, becoming neither her mother's victim nor her benefactor's charity case, but herself, flawed, strong, compassionate, and entirely her own person. The story that had gone viral ended where all viral stories eventually end, forgotten by everyone except the people who actually lived it, replaced in the cultural consciousness by newer scandals and fresher catastrophes, but forever preserved in the internet's infinite memory for anyone who cared to search for it. But the lives the story had touched continued beyond the viral moment. beyond the neat narrative, beyond the simple satisfaction of seeing cruelty punished. They continued in the complicated, unglamorous work of surviving, healing, growing, and choosing every day to be slightly better than the worst things that had happened to them.